What's up? Hey there, party people. It is, I'm losing track of time. I think it's week 5 here in the world of the third quarter. We're going to talk about, in this lecture today, isolationism, or isolation to World War II. What we mean by that is isolationism was the policy of the United States to stay uninvolved in world affairs, focus about issues that are happening right here at home. So how do we go from the isolationist policies of the 20s and the 30s and get to World War II, which is obviously a non-isolationist event? We're talking about the world at large here. So let's go ahead and begin. So one of the questions you'll have an opportunity to answer in your post-discussion board is it the role of the U.S. to get involved in international disputes? Or worry more about what's happening here at home? So following World War I, the United States was reluctant to become involved in overseas conflicts that led to war. You might remember that prior to the First World War, the United States, was involved in all these international areas like the Philippines and the Caribbean, and those are really the exceptions. The 1920s and the 1930s were an era of increased isolationism, anti-war feeling, and just kind of stick to ourselves ideas. Americans were reluctant to be involved with the world affairs. After World War I, Americans had returned to their traditional policy of isolation. They felt safe behind the oceans that separated them from the troubles of Europe and Asia. They raised tariffs, restricted immigration, and even insisted that their wartime allies, France and Britain, pay them back the debts that they owed to Americans. I'm sure you can see that. Ooh, moving my head around the screen. It's a grand old time to do that. Yes, it is. Right. There were a few exceptions, as I mentioned earlier. Let's go back. There were a few exceptions. One of those exceptions was a few events in the 1920s, like the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was actually an agreement by 62 nations to avoid ever using war. And in 1921, one of the worst presidents ever hosted a naval conference where world powers agreed to limit the size of their navies. Well, Warren G. Harding was a terrible person. And he was the last president of Ohio, and for good reason, probably. Lots of scandals, died of a heart attack. But in the early 1800s, most of Spain's Latin American colonies rebelled and established themselves as independent nations, which kind of changed American policy for a time. The United States feared that Spain or other nations might reconquer these newly independent areas. President Monroe, who is an interesting feller, had this idea called the Monroe Doctrine, that the Western Hemisphere, basically North America and South America, shall belong to the interests of the United States. Well, this speech he gave was pretty much unimportant for like 70 years, all right? But then all of a sudden, in the early 1900s, people cared about what Monroe said 70 years ago when it had no effect in between. And so the United States started to get involved in what happened in the Caribbean and whatnot, South America. President Roosevelt had a policy known as the Big Stick Policy, which is really actually cool. I think Teddy's a cool dude. But Theodore Roosevelt barred European countries from being involved in the Caribbean. So, like being involved in the Dominican, he said the U.S. would basically enforce the Monroe Doctrine. He believed that the Western Hemisphere is a hemisphere of American influence. And here I have a cool picture of Teddy, dragging around his boats. He's got a big stick. Actually, he said, speak softly and carry a big stick. So, like, basically the idea is talk nice and then have a large army behind you to back up what you say. It soon became, as I said, the Big Stick Policy. Roosevelt strongly believed that this threat of force, rather than the actual use of force, was sufficient to prevent the military conflict. So, like, ask politely, Europe, please stay out of our affairs on this side of the globe. And don't even notice my large navy behind me. It's a friendly navy. Psst, not really. All right, so, in fact, many of the political cartoons of the period showed Roosevelt swinging that large club, like I said. Roosevelt used the big stick several times to interfere with Latin American policy and used it as a justification to send troops in at a number of occasions. Now, these interventions in Haiti and Nicaragua and Honduras and the Dominican Republic were deeply resented by Latin American countries, right? Why wouldn't they be? Do you want some other nation coming in and telling you what to do? And critics denounced Roosevelt as an imperialist. Roosevelt did not object to this term. He rather delighted, actually, in the idea of an American empire. So we talked about the progressive era, and we talked about Teddy as a progressive. But also Teddy is interesting because he's Abraham Lincoln died in 1865, and the period between 1865 and 1901 has a bunch of weak and wimpy presidents until Teddy. Teddy comes in, and he's just a boss. I mean, he tells people what to do, and people do it. So Teddy kind of also reinvigorates the presidency as this all-powerful being. Anyways, Teddy Roosevelt obviously had one way of handling things, and Taft had another, which was actually called dollar diplomacy. Taft's the guy who comes after Teddy, you may remember from our progressive era talks. Now, following President Roosevelt, President Taft encouraged bankers to invest in the Caribbean region, so that way we could make Caribbean nations tied to the American dollar, right? Great idea. And if countries failed to repay the loan, the U.S. government would have cause to send in troops, which they actually did, in places like Nicaragua. So, all that was great and all, but as I mentioned, the 1920s and the 1930s were all about isolationism. The dollar diplomacy, the big stick policy, they were the things of the past, right? FDR comes in, we talked about FDR's New Deal. By the late 1920s, American leaders sought to improve relations with the world, replace the big stick with what FDR called the good neighbor policy. Here's a picture of FDR, looking dapper as always. So FDR sought to improve relations. So by being peaceful with everybody, we can stay out of everyone's business. He called this approach the good neighbor policy. Won't you be my neighbor? Is that what Mr. Rogers said? Under this policy, relations between the United States and Latin America improved. But it's hard to be a good neighbor to everybody when your neighbor is evil. So, unfortunately, the United States has some evil neighbors out there in the world. Not neighbors, but they're kind of down the street nuisances. People like Stalin, who was a brutal totalitarian dictator you should learn about last year. And Mussolini from Italy. And, of course, Adolf Hitler, right? It's hard to be a good neighbor when your neighbor is literally psychotic. Right? The kind of neighbor that comes over to your yard and makes you tear down your whole fence because it's 1 inch on his property. So we actually have a video here, which normally we would watch in class. You should really, it's really kind of short. Go to YouTube, access the PowerPoint, and watch this on your own time. It's really worth a watch. It gives you a recap of some things you should have learned in world history last year. Now, the idea of collective security, that peaceful nations would band together to stop aggressors, failed when countries like the Soviet Union, all right, failed to join the League, all right? And we remember we have some bad neighbors here. With the two major powers like the United States and the Soviet Union, though, not joining the League, nothing was really done to stop other bad neighbors like Hitler and Mussolini from getting involved in all sort of international conflicts, like in Spain and Japan getting involved in Manchuria. And the League of Nations, which was charged with preventing another war, you may remember that the League of Nations, which was Woodrow Wilson's baby, it was too weak to resist it because the United States and the Soviet Union, the two biggest economies, did not join the League, right? So Hitler got to do what he wanted. Mussolini got to do what he wanted. You know, the Japanese got to do what they want. They were all bad neighbors. So as tensions mounted in Europe, right? Hitler's out there invading all sorts of countries. Mussolini's out there invading all sorts of countries. Japan's just going crazy in China. And the nation still hoped to be dragged into another war, right? And there were all sorts of anti-war sentiments and peace movements going on. And to avoid a similar turn of events, Congress actually enacted the Neutrality Act, which prohibited Americans from traveling on ships of nations at war. That will keep us out of war. All right. So Americans were also barred from selling arms to other countries. Right. Americans could not sell non-military goods to Britain. Let's just send them everything else but bullets, food, clothes, boots, you name it, trucks. All right. So then Japan invaded China in 1937, and Roosevelt delivered something called the Quarantine Speech. He told the nations that the peaceful nations had to act together to quarantine aggressive nations. Not sure what that means, but let's go ahead and isolate these countries. Roosevelt encouraged democratic nations to boycott the aggressors, boycotting their sales of goods and whatnot. Most Americans, however, remained opposed to any U.S. action. However, some Americans still actually felt that the world was in too much chaos to not be involved. U.S. volunteer fighter pilots known as the Flying Tigers were recruited to fly in supplies and engage in combat with the Japanese pilots. And as war in Europe began in 1939, Americans still hoped to avoid war, but began preparing just in case. So Congress increased spending on the Army and the Navy, and even passed a peacetime draft. Sounds like war's inevitable now. And by the time the 1940s are rolling out, that doesn't seem possible for them to avoid war anymore. They start actually giving military aid to the United Kingdom. They had this whole destroyers for bases thing going on here. Let's give 50 destroyers for a few British bases. And in 1941, Roosevelt proposed the Lend-Lease Act to sell, lease, or lend war materials to any country the president saw as vital to the defense of the U.S. So let's just sell stuff to Britain, is the long story short. And American ships began crossing the Atlantic, which was actually dangerous, delivering ship supplies to the British. And in late 1941, Roosevelt met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and announced that they sought freedom of the seas, which might sound familiar of you, and to end the war. They signed the Atlantic Charter, laying the foundations for what would later become the United Nations. Don't really worry about that right now. We'll talk a lot about that later. And President Roosevelt began to feel, again, that entering the war was inevitable. And if Hitler defeated the British, that they would sooner or later, attack the United States. And we actually do know now that there really was like a Nazi plan to invade the United States, which is insane. If you've ever watched like Man in the High Castle, it's like an alternate history series where if like Nazi Germany actually won. So in 1941, armed American merchant ships were authorized to carry supplies directly to the British. War was simply a matter of time at this point. But it actually wasn't the Germans that forced us into this war. It was the Japanese, right? With their bombing of Pearl Harbor, finally bringing the nation into the Second World War, ending United States isolationism. All right, so if you guys have any questions for me, go ahead and email me at ksearcy@spartan.limacityschools.org. Also, check out this fun America Enters the War World II YouTube video from the History Channel in your spare time. Don't forget to respond to the discussion board about the question first posted at the beginning of class. All right, peace.